Could you imagine that the first slave owner in America was black, or that the Civil War ended slavery? These are some of the myths that surround the dark chapter of slavery in human history. This murky past has been riddled with misconceptions and misinformation, creating a distorted view that has been passed down through generations. Today, we will be addressing 8 common myths about slavery, each one more surprising than the last. From the alleged first black slave owner in America to the misguided belief that slavery was solely a Southern institution, we'll be exploring the truths and debunking the myths. We will also delve into the role of women in slave owning and the controversial involvement of Christians in slavery. This journey will not only challenge our preconceived notions, but also enlighten us about the harsh realities of this grim period in history. Let's embark on this journey to unveil the truths and debunk the myths of slavery. Let's start with the shocking myth that the first slave owner in America was black. This refers to Anthony Johnson, an African who, after being brought to the British colonies in North America on a Dutch ship in 1619, managed to secure his freedom. He went on to become a successful tobacco farmer, and yes, he did legally own slaves. But here's where it gets twisted. This fact often gets manipulated to suggest that slavery was not a racially structured, brutal system. Anthony Johnson's story, while unique and intriguing, is not representative of the origins of slavery, nor does it mitigate the horrors and systemic exploitation of the transatlantic slave trade. The vast majority of slave owners were white, and they enforced a system of racial hierarchy and dehumanization that lasted for centuries. So, the truth is, Anthony Johnson's story is an exception, not the norm. Did Africans enslave each other? Let's explore this myth. When we think about slavery, the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade often comes to mind. However, before this horrendous period, slavery did exist in some African societies. It's essential to note that this form of slavery was markedly different from what we know of the transatlantic slave trade. In Africa, slavery varied greatly depending on the region and society. It ranged from being a form of punishment for crimes to serving as economic labor. It was not widespread or systematic, and it certainly did not involve the dehumanizing aspects associated with the transatlantic slave trade. There was no mass capture and forced transportation of people across an ocean, no brutal conditions on plantations, no families torn apart at auctions. So while slavery did exist in Africa, it was not comparable to the transatlantic slave trade. The Civil War, a war to end slavery? Not quite. While it's true the Civil War was fought with the intention to end the abomination of slavery, it led to the birth of a new system known as convict leasing. This system was essentially slavery by another name. It involved leasing out prisoners to private businesses, often subjecting them to brutal conditions and exploitation similar to those endured by slaves. Convict leasing was disproportionately directed at black individuals, many of whom were arrested on minor charges or for crimes they did not commit. This system continued well into the 20th century, perpetuating the oppression of African Americans long after the supposed end of slavery. So, while the Civil War did bring about the legal end of slavery, it did not completely eradicate the underlying systemic oppression and exploitation. Therefore, slavery did not truly end with the Civil War. Were women really passive participants in slavery? Let's debunk this myth. It's a common misconception that women were merely passive observers in the institution of slavery, but the reality tells a different story. Women, in fact, actively participated in the slave trade. They managed family estates and fought for the rights to own slaves. Prominent figures like Martha Washington, the wife of the first president of the United States, owned slaves. She inherited them from her first husband and managed them throughout her life. Mary Chestnut, another example, was the wife of a senator from the South. She, too, owned slaves and was vocal about her views on slavery. These women, among others, were deeply involved in the operations of slave owning. Their active participation challenges the widely held notion of women as mere bystanders in the narrative of slavery. Contrary to popular belief, women were not just bystanders in the history of slavery. Did slavery only exist in the South? Let's find out. The common perception is that slavery was a practice confined to the southern states of America. But the truth is far more complex. While the South may have been home to the sprawling plantations we often associate with slavery, the North was far from innocent. The North was deeply involved in the slave trade through industries such as shipping and manufacturing. Northern ports played a pivotal role in the transatlantic slave trade, serving as bustling hubs where enslaved Africans were bought and sold. Moreover, prominent Northerners owned slaves. One such example is John Hancock, a revered figure in American history, who was a slave owner. It's essential to understand that the scourge of slavery was a nationwide issue, deeply ingrained in the economic, political, and social fabric of the entire country. So, slavery was not just a Southern phenomenon. Did the Union really go to war to end slavery? Let's debunk this myth. The American Civil War was a complex event with a multitude of factors at play, and while slavery was indeed a major issue, it was not the sole cause. The North and the South had developed along different lines, economically, socially, and politically. The North had moved towards a more industrial economy and was keen to regulate slavery and protect its industries. On the other hand, the South, which was heavily reliant on agriculture and slave labor, was resistant to this change and protective of its states' rights. Furthermore, there were other contentious issues such as tariffs and economic policies that contributed to the tension between these two regions. So, while slavery was a pivotal issue that fueled the conflict, it was not the only reason the Union went to war. The Civil War was not solely about ending slavery. Did Europeans really physically enslave Africans? Let's find out. It's a common misconception that Europeans were the primary agents of enslavement in Africa. However, historical records indicate a different story. While it's undeniable that European nations played a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, they were primarily involved in buying slaves rather than physically capturing and enslaving Africans. The reality is, the practice of slavery was already established in many African societies before European involvement. In fact, Europeans found it more efficient to purchase slaves from African traders who capitalized on internal conflicts and warfare to capture and sell their own people. It's crucial to understand that the transatlantic slave trade was a complex system involving multiple parties, not just the Europeans. So, Europeans were not the primary agents of enslavement in Africa. Were Christians really not involved in slavery? Let's debunk this myth. It's not uncommon to encounter the belief that Christians, guided by their faith's principles of love and compassion, were not involved in the grim business of slavery. However, the historical record tells a different story. Many prominent Christians were indeed involved in the slave trade and even owned slaves. They often used religious justifications to defend this practice. Some interpreted Bible passages to suggest that slavery was not only acceptable but divinely ordained. This selective reading of religious texts allowed them to reconcile their faith with the brutal realities of slave ownership. However, it's important to note that not all Christians supported slavery. Many were vocal opponents and played crucial roles in the abolitionist movement. So, contrary to popular belief, many Christians were involved in slavery. As we've seen, there are many myths about slavery that persist today. We've debunked some of the most prevalent ones, from the misconception that the first slave owner in America was black, to the falsehood that slavery was limited to the South. We've uncovered the uncomfortable truth about women's involvement in slave owning and the North's role in the slave trade. We've also challenged the belief that the Civil War ended slavery and that the Union went to war solely to abolish this heinous practice. We've shed light on the fact that Europeans were more involved in slave buying than physically enslaving Africans, and that many Christians, contrary to popular belief, were deeply involved in the slave trade. These are just a few of the misinterpretations and inaccuracies that cloud our understanding of this dark chapter in human history. By debunking these myths, we can gain a more accurate understanding of the horrors of slavery and its lasting impact on society.